Dastyari goes to ground as Attorney General questions whether he obeyed the law. Embattled Labour Senator Sam Dastyari has gone to ground, cancelling an event in Sydney and maintaining an unusually low media profile as the government continues to pressure Bill Shorten to sack him from the shadow cabinet. Attorney General George Brandis has refused to rule out the possibility Senator Dastyari broke the law, although it is unclear what rule would have been breached. He issued a challenge to Mr. Shorten, asking whether he is willing to accept a senior colleague being in the pay of a foreign-controlled entity. Calls for reform of the political donation system have also strengthened as Greens leader Richard Di Natale, joined by Conservative Senator Cory Bernardi, propose allowing only people on the Australian electoral roll to donate to parties, halting contributions from companies, unions and foreign entities. But Senator Brandis has rejected any immediate moves for reform, insisting there is no link between the broader system and the Dastyari imbroglio, which involved a private debt being paid by a Chinese-Australian donor and the senator's rogue support for China's position in the South China Sea dispute. The Attorney General said the Labour power broker, who is the manager of opposition business in the Senate and Labour's Consumer Affairs spokesman, may have broken the law in his dealings, and we are not going to be having any conversation other than that. In the Senate last Thursday, I asked 47 specific questions about the two donations, and I called upon Senator Dastyari to explain the circumstances of those donations, and we have not heard a word from him, and, more importantly, we haven't heard a word from Mr. Shorten, Senator Brandis said. Now this is a test for Mr. Shorten, and the test is this: is Mr. Shorten prepared to accept on his front bench, in the alternative government of Australia, a standard of conduct radically lower than the Turnbull government is prepared to accept? On Monday, Senator Dastyari cancelled at late notice his attendance at a forum hosted by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Sydney with Cabinet Secretary Arthur Sinodinos, instead sending colleague Ed Husick. It is unclear what laws would have been broken, as the Attorney General contemplated, and Cabinet Minister Christopher Pyne was forced to backtrack from a similar claim on Monday. Coalition figures have argued the donation system is a different conversation to Senator Dastyari's arrangement, which involved a gift made personally to him. Labour frontbencher Stephen Conroy has also sought to shift attention to $500,000 of China-linked donations to the Wa Liberal Party, arguing Foreign Minister Julie Bishop has been compromised by foreign donations. I can understand why certain people like Stephen Conroy want to change the subject, but I'm not going to change the subject because this is about a particular individual, Sam Dastyari, who has accepted money from an entity that is effectively controlled by the Chinese state, and as a result of that, he has sought from within the Labour Party to change their attitude on a crucial foreign policy position, said Senator Brandis. Fairfax Media revealed last week the $1,600 arrangement with Chinese-Australian businessman Min Zhu, before it emerged that Senator Dastyari made comments to Chinese-language media about the South China Sea dispute. Last year, Fairfax Media reported that the senator had Yuhu Group executive and prolific donor Huang Shangmo pay his legal fees. Senator Dastyari has since expressed regret at the arrangement with Dr. Zhu, donating the equivalent amount to charity and backing his party's position on the South China Sea dispute. The Labour Party has proposed banning foreign donations and lowering the threshold for public disclosure, and multiple Liberal MPs, including Transport Minister Darren Chester, Trade Minister Steve Ciobo and backbencher Craig Kelly, have expressed support for change, while Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has consistently supported the principle of limiting donations to individuals without a clear policy on donations reform. Senior government figures have mostly kept their focus on Senator Dastyari. Thank you for watching movie. Subscribe and like to support us. Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative activist, has died at age 92. Phyllis Schlafly, a conservative activist, lawyer and author who is credited with almost single-handedly stopping the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s and who helped move the Republican Party toward the right on family and religious issues, died Monday at her home in St. Louis. She was 92. Her daughter, Ann Corey, said Mrs. Schlafly had been ill with cancer for some time. A champion of traditional, stay-at-home roles for women, Mrs. Schlafly opposed the era because she believed it would open the door to same-sex marriage, abortion, the military draft for women, co-ed bathrooms and the end of labor laws that barred women from dangerous workplaces. The brief Equal Rights Amendment, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, was anti-family and anti-American. She said, equality, she added, would be a step down for most women, who she said are extremely well treated by society and laws. Mrs. Schlafly was almost too late to stop the amendment's passage. By early 1972, when she first published her objections, it had just passed Congress, and 30 of the necessary 38 state legislatures had ratified it. Mrs. Schlafly, an experienced anti-communist Republican Party activist, quickly organized the opposition. The effort began operating under the name Stop ERA and later became a national organization called the Eagle Forum, which Mrs. Schlafly dubbed an alternative to women's liberation. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision on Roe v. Wade, legalizing abortion. Suddenly, a huge constituency of conservative, family-oriented churchgoers was energized to engage in politics, binding together fundamentalists, evangelicals, Catholics, Mormons and Orthodox Jews. Mrs. Schlafly realized that she could direct a movement of people who believed the family and traditional values were under attack. A best-selling author, radio commentator and an excellent debater, she barnstormed the country, speaking before clubs, church organizations and 30 state legislatures. By the time the deadline for passage of the ERA arrived in 1982, 15 states had rejected it and 5 others had rescinded their ratifications. The measure fell 3 states short of passage. Mrs. Schlafly staged a festive burial party at Washington's Shoreham Hotel and told a crowded news conference that the ERA is dead for now and forever in this century. The nation could enter a new era of harmony between women and men, she said. Just as her public life didn't begin with the ERA, it didn't end with its defeat. The battle over the amendment helped launch the family values and the abortion movement in the United States, and Mrs. Schlafly continued to be one of its standard-bearers, as well as supporting causes such as opposition to illegal immigrants, federal judicial activism, ballots in languages other than English, the Title X rules that required equal treatment of girls and boys in sports, and privacy-invading questions on the census. Secretaries, stewardesses and other women fighting for pay of comparable worth were simply envious of the wages of janitors and truck drivers, Mrs. Schlafly said, always quotable. Her opinions could outrage and provoke even members of her own political party's establishment. When President Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, tried to introduce AIDS education to public school curriculums in the 1980s, Mrs. Schlafly likened it to the teaching of safe sodomy. She called sex education a principal cause of teenage pregnancy. Reagan-appointed Supreme Court Justice Anthony M. Kennedy ran afoul of Mrs. Schlafly in 2005 when his opinion questioning capital punishment for juveniles seemed to her to be grounds for impeachment. She said during the 2010 Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington that no woman, including former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin, was yet ready to be president. Although she had cheered Palin's selection as the Republicans' 2008 vice presidential nominee, calling her as an exemplar of all that is good and true. Mrs. Schlafly was an attorney who built her own media empire, writing or editing 20 books. She published a monthly newsletter, the Phyllis Schlafly Report, wrote a syndicated newspaper column, produced radio commentaries and anchored a radio talk show. She also was a regular lecturer on the college circuit. Mrs. Schlafly was the subject of two biographies. Carol Felsenthal's The Sweetheart of the Silent Majority, 1981, and Donald Critchlow's Phyllis Schlafly and Grassroots Conservatism, 2006. Reagan appointed her to the Commission on the Bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution, and Ladies' Home Journal named her one of the 100 most important women of the 20th century. An indication of her continuing relevance and her ability to stir up emotions came in 2008 when hundreds of students protested when her alma mater, Washington University in St. Louis, granted her an honorary diploma. Well-spoken, self-assured, dressed like an affluent homemaker, with a hairdo like a treble clef, as Genia Belafonte of the New York Times said in 2006, Mrs. Schlafly drove feminists nuts. A woman's most important job is to be a wife and mother, Mrs. Schlafly repeatedly said, even as she employed a full-time housekeeper to care for her 6 children. She said she was never away from home overnight and often took her infants with her to speaking engagements. In 1992, her home state of Illinois named her its Mother of the Year. "I'd like to thank my husband, Fred, for letting me be here today," she told a crowd of 11,000 at a pro-family gathering in 1977. "I like to say that because it irritates the women's libbers more than anything." In 1981, speaking at a Senate Labor Committee hearing on sexual harassment in the workplace, Mrs. Schlafly said that men hardly ever ask sexual favors of women from whom the certain answer is no. Virtuous women are seldom accosted by unwelcome sexual propositions or familiarities, obscene talk or profane language. She never shrank from battle, agreeing countless times to debate well-known feminists such as Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem and Eleanor Smeal. In one such face-off, at Illinois State University in 1973, the often volatile Friedan called Mrs. Schlafly a traitor to her sex and said she would like to burn her at the stake. 4 years later, after Mrs. Schlafly implied that all the women at a women's conference in Houston were gay, Steinem, one of the few feminists who could match her quotes, retorted, "If we're all lesbians, where are we getting all these unborn babies to kill?" Born Phyllis McAlpin Stewart on August 15, 1924, in St. Louis. She was the daughter of a librarian who supported the family of 4 when Phyllis's father could not find work during the Depression. Mrs. Schlafly attended 2 years of college at Maryville College of the Sacred Heart, but the school was not rigorous enough for her, she later said. So she paid her way through Washington University by working 48 hours a week in a World War II ordnance plant, firing machine guns to test the ammunition. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa and then earned a master's degree in political science in 1945 from Radcliffe College, Harvard University's sister school for women. She headed to Washington for a year to do research for what is now the American Enterprise Institute, then went back to St. Louis to work on a congressman's re-election campaign and to be a research director at 2 local banks. She said she was saved from the life as a working girl by marrying wealthy lawyer Fred Schlafly in 1949. She quit her job and became a community volunteer and Republican Party activist. In the early 1950s, she did research for Sen. Joseph R. McCarthy, the Wisconsin Republican who railed against communist infiltration into the U.S. government. Mrs. Schlafly won the Republican nomination for Congress from Alton Hill on her first try in 1952, presenting herself as a House Sep. She lost in the general election to the incumbent. She was a delegate to the 1956 Republican National Convention, and in 1960 she tried again for Congress, this time as a write-in candidate. At the 1960 Republican National Convention, she helped lead a revolt of conservatives against an anti-segregation and anti-discrimination plank in the party's platform. She and her husband also founded the Cardinal Mind Sinti Foundation to alert the world to the dangers of communism. She published pamphlets that compiled right-wing essays and in 1962 became a radio commentator on a program carried by 18 stations. "The atomic bomb," she said, "was a marvelous gift given to our country by a wise God." An enthusiastic supporter of Barry Goldwater, the Republican nominee for president in 1964, Mrs. Schlafly wrote her first book, A Choice Not an Echo, attacking the elite East Coast kingmakers of the party who ignored the grassroots conservatives who were Goldwater's base. She published it herself as a mail-order paperback, and it sold more than 3 million copies before Election Day. The success inspired her to write a series of books about national defense, in partnership with retired Navy ADM Chester Ward. One accused Defense Secretary Robert S. McNamara and presidential advisors McGeorge Bundy and Walt Rostow of deliberately weakening the U.S. military so that the Soviets could overwhelm the United States. Another, written by herself, contended that communists instigated the urban riots in 1967. Mrs. Schlafly also rose in the ranks of the National Federation of Republican Women, becoming first vice president. She was in line to rise to president, but Goldwater's loss to Lyndon B. Johnson in the presidential race brought a resurgence of the party's liberal wing, and Mrs. Schlafly was outmaneuvered for leadership of the group. She founded the Eagles Are Flying, a separate group for her supporters in the National Federation of Republican Women, as well as a trust fund for conservative candidates and her own newsletter. In 1970, she tried a third time to win election to Congress but again lost to an incumbent. Her decision to enter law school in the early 1970s was temporarily halted by the objections of her husband. Although he had encouraged all their children to go to law school, he changed his mind 2 weeks later, and she graduated from Washington University's law school in 1978. In 1993, after 44 years of marriage, her husband died, and Mrs. Schlafly moved back to St. Louis from their longtime home in Alton. Survivors include 6 children, Corey, Bruce Schlafly and Liza Forsaw, all of St. Louis, John Schlafly of Alton, who came out as gay in 1992, Roger Schlafly of Santa Cruz, California, and Andrew Schlafly of Far Hills, NJ, who started Conservapedia in 2006 as a reaction against perceived liberal bias in Wikipedia. 16 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. Mrs. Schlafly's opposition to the era developed only after a friend invited her to speak about the proposed constitutional amendment to a Darien Khan book club in early 1972. Until then, she said later, she was unaware of the then 50-year-old proposal. At first, she recalled, "I don't even know what side I'm on. I figured ERA was something between innocuous and mildly helpful." Thank you for watching movie. Subscribe and like to suppose us. https:// Pokémon Sun and Moon will let you take pictures Pokémon Snap style. Fans are still yearning for a new Pokémon Snap, but this might be the next best thing. A new feature in Pokémon Sun and Moon will let you take pictures of pocket monsters out in the wild. It's called a Poké Finder, and will only be available in select areas around the Alola region. Sun and Moon's take on Hawaii. Once you snap a pic, you can then submit it to be evaluated, and as your skills improve you'll get access to more photographic tools, like zoom functionality. Share on Facebook. Tweet share 10 pin 2. Fans are still yearning for a new Pokémon Snap, but this might be the next best thing. A new feature in Pokémon Sun and Moon will let you take pictures of pocket monsters out in the wild. It's called a Poké Finder, and will only be available in select areas around the Alola region. Sun and Moon's take on Hawaii. Once you snap a pic, you can then submit it to be evaluated, and as your skills improve you'll get access to more photographic tools, like zoom functionality. Alongside the photography mode, the Pokémon Company also revealed a handful of other new features for the upcoming 3DS games. That includes a number of new Pokémon, such as the synthetic Monster Null and the Alolan variant of Raticate, and a new type of shape-shifting creature called an Ultra Beast. Most importantly, though, is information on how the two versions of the game will differ. Here's how the developers describe it. In previous games, you could discover certain Pokémon in only one of the two versions of the game. Now, in addition to this feature, there will be a difference in the way time is set in the two games. The two worlds of Pokémon Sun and Pokémon Moon are 12 hours apart and are tied to the actual time in real life. Pokémon Sun operates on the same time as your Nintendo 3DS system, but time in the world of Pokémon Moon is shifted by 12 hours. You'll be able to see all of the new features for yourself when Pokémon Sun and Moon launch on the Nintendo 3DS on November 18th. Thank you for watching movie. Subscribe and like to support us.